So, right off the bat, I'll apologize for the length of this introduction, but seeing as this is the first episode, it seems like the proper time to lay out my expectations and intentions. And I don't have expectations, but I do have intentions. So, there are millions of podcasts now, and because of that, I don't really expect much of a listenership. Sorry, that's Pins, my cat, who, if you're on video, you can see she's participating. But anyway, so there are millions of podcasts now, and I don't expect much of a listenership because of that. So far, though, I've recorded 20 episodes. I think about 20 episodes, and I intend to keep it up as long as it's fun. So this is something that I've wanted to do for years, but only now because I've graduated from Columbia in New York, and I'm going to Stanford for a PhD. Do I have access to people in the tops of their fields? So my intention is just to have conversations, whether they're fascinating or just fun. And so far, I've spoken with philosophers, mathematicians, strength trainers, doctors, a bunch of my friends. I even had an episode with my uncle just talking about ice cream, which is probably my favorite one that I've done so far. But anyway, I only hope that other people might enjoy the conversations like I do. Maybe at some point I'll have some solo episodes, but for now I'll post one a week, maybe two occasionally because I have this big backlog, and I'll post them on Monday mornings. So this first episode is particularly special to me because it's with a professor of mine from Columbia. He's the most important teacher I've ever had and one of the most important people in my life. And though I don't like this word, if I have a mentor, it's him. So Haim Gaifman is a mathematician, a probability theorist, a philosopher, and a theoretical computer scientist, among other things. He got his PhD from one of the most important logicians of the 20th century, Alfred Tarski, at Berkeley in mathematics in 1962 with a thesis on infinite Boolean algebras. He was also, if you're into philosophy, Rudolf Carnap's research assistant in Foundations of Probability. And those are just two huge titans in philosophy. So, though he's published groundbreaking and original results in all sorts of areas, not just mathematics, he was once the world leader in non-standard models of piano arithmetic and was formative in the development of model theory, which is one of the four branches of mathematical logic as they're generally conceived. Another mathematician, Roman Cossack, he's a professor emeritus at CUNY in New York, once told me that Haim is one of the last old masters of his generation. So, with that being said, I just finished re listening to our conversation, which we had about 2 months ago when I was still in NYC, finishing up at Columbia. And now, like I mentioned, I'm on my way to Stanford, spending the summer in Chicago, where I'm from. But in Stanford, I'll be studying symbolic logic, foundations of mathematics, and certainly a variety of other things. And in our conversation, we discuss a philosophical topic called vagueness. And it's different from vagueness or ambiguity, how we use those words in everyday life, though there are some similarities. But vagueness deals with quote unquote borderline phenomena. So, can a single hair distinguish a bald man from a non bald man? Or can one grain of sand distinguish a heap of sand from a non heap of sand? And though it might seem like a simple topic on the surface level, giving it a thorough treatment really quickly becomes subtle and sophisticated and very difficult. So our conversation starts out just a bit slowly with a story Haim told me that comes from Jewish folklore, but then we pretty quickly get into the meat of the issue. And we touch on classical solutions to vagueness, as well as some more topical and contemporary issues, such as Roe v. Wade and the arbitrariness of determining when a fetus is or isn't viable. I probably interrupt Haim too much, but I like to think that after 20 episodes, I'm slowly getting better at this, so we'll see where I'm at come episode 50. Also, please forgive the audio and video editing. At this point, I'm doing it myself, and because I'm just doing this for fun, I'm also being a bit lazy, so this is a one-take introduction, and I'm not doing any editing really at all. So, lastly, not every episode will be this technical, though some will probably be more so. I talk with a leading number theorist at Columbia in one episode, and we talk a lot about math. But some won't be technical at all, like when I speak with my uncle about ice cream, and I eat 3 pints during that episode, so you can look forward to that. But anyway, I hope you enjoy my talk with my talk with Haim Gaifman. I'm not going to edit that out. But now I'll hand it over to Robinson, the drummer. There's my drum set for some intro music. And wow, this has been 6 minutes. I apologize. Okay, I've already lied, actually. Just one last note. I sprung this on Haim at the last moment, and though he really held his own very well under my questioning, he didn't get to prepare for this at all, and last taught a course on vagueness over a year before we recorded this conversation. What I was hoping to talk about with you today, Professor, is vagueness.
Oh, yeah, okay.
In particular, the Sorites paradox.
Right.
Because I know you know a great deal about that. And I thought a nice way to start would be hearing your story about the young man in rabbi school. I think that's a good that's a good way of illustrating what vagueness is for people who don't know.
Okay, so this is it's actually in the Talmud, but it is there's a part of the Talmud which is, so to speak, legends and tales and so on. I mean, the Talmud is a huge collection of literature that covers hundreds of years. So it's all there.
Is that part of the Torah or
the
Bible? It's something different?
No. It's we are speaking about difference of 1,000 years or something like that.
It predates the Bible?
It comes after the Bible.
Okay.
The Bible is the source, the most holy source, so to speak, of Jewish religion, the written Bible. This is called Torah shebechtav. That means the law as it is written. And so this would be the Jewish Bible. It wouldn't include the New Testament. And when the Christians speak about the Bible, they mean all of it, including the New Testament. And sometimes they just mean only the New Testament. But New Testament, there are the Matthew, this what they call, I forgot the
Gospels?
The Gospels, but there are there are the Matthew, Luke, and
Peter,
and John, and then there is also, but Luke I think is much later.
Okay. But so we're talking about the Talmud, which is
the Talmud is starts from 500 BC and goes on to about 1000 AD.
Okay.
So it covers a collection of rules, discussions, legends, tales, gossip of 1500 years. So it's a huge body. And it starts from the Mishnah, which is more direct interpretation, and then interpretation of the Mishnah and interpretation of the interpretation, and so on. This is what it consists of. So there's a story about Rabbi Jeremiah, I think, some not Jeremiah the prophet, who was much who lived about 525 BC, but much later Rabbi Jeremiah, that was present in one of the discussions in the Talmud. And there is a rule is about what do you do if you find a chick of a bird that fell from its nest in a tree. Should you return it to the nest, or can you take it for yourself?
And if you take it for yourself, is the assumption going to be that you're going to eat it, or you're going to keep it as a pet? Or?
No. You can do with it whatever you want. It's usually eating it or keeping it as a pet.
Okay.
But I don't think they had a culture of keeping birds as pets.
And just to clarify though, so where this rule is, this is sort of like kosher law, something like that.
No, this is a law which precedes this discussion. It can be in the Mishnah, or the Mishnah is before the Talmud, but it's still in the interpretation of the law.
Okay.
It comes perhaps as an interpretation of a text which is several hundred years older.
Okay. But it's actual law.
It's actual. Well,
so there's a law. What can you do?
What you can do? Yeah, they discuss
when
the
you
law.
Find a chick.
But actually, if you want to know what the law is, you have to go to another body of, because the tradition later is a poskim, that the one who really decides how to decide practical cases, which comes to the rabbi at the time, at their time. But this is. These are based on the Talmud and the Mishnah, but this is what a rabbi would really do.
Okay.
And then it depends what kind of rabbi is it, very conservative, reform, and so on. It can be all kinds of streams. And in Judaism. So there are the conservatives, there are the orthodox, and there are the reform.
Okay. I'm getting you too far off track from the story.
Yes, well, I mean, you want to know more detail, I'll give you more detail.
Okay, so
they are discussing this, and it says, if it falls down, and if it is within 500 feet or 50 feet or something. It's not feet, it's something like this. The distance, this is what's the distance is.
Something before feet, however they were measuring distance back then.
If it's within 50 feet, you must return it to the nests, because it belongs to its mother. But if it is more than 50, then you can take it for yourself, and the implication being you can eat it, or kill it and eat it, or do with it whatever you want. You want to free it, and so on. It's your property. And then Rabbi Jeremiah asked them, what happens if one foot, if it spreads its legs and one foot is within and the other foot is without? So they threw him out of the
rabbi school.
They threw him out from the room where they were studying, because they thought he was just trying to confuse them, or a joke or something like that.
And so what this illustrates is broadly that vagueness in philosophy is concerned with borderline phenomena, where you can't tell.
Yeah, that is usually the definition of vagueness.
Right, and vagueness, as far as you know, did it begin with Eubulides?
Vagueness, yes, because Eubulides is the author of the Sorites paradox.
And the bald man.
And the bald man.
So that seems like a good place to go next. So really quickly, what's the bald man paradox?
The bald man paradox is really a variation of the Sorites. Sorites means the hip paradox.
Right. I think it comes from Soros, which might mean grain or something like that.
I don't know Greek, so I wouldn't be able to. Yeah, but something like that. Now, it means their hip, really.
Mm-hmm.
The bald man is another version that means a man without any hair on his head. Not that he shaves his head, but any hair of his head is certainly bald, or a man with a head full of hair is not bald. Now, if you omit one hair and it is not a bald man, it still doesn't. But if you continue plucking out the hair, eventually it becomes bald. So,
right.
So this is another version of the Sorites.
So at some point, he starts out not bald.
Yeah.
At some point, he is completely bald.
Right.
And presumably, if he's got 2 or 3 hairs on his head, he's bald. But the idea that one hair is
Makes
going to
right.
distinguish a bald man from a not bald man
Right.
is absurd.
Yes.
And then the Sorites paradox
This is
similar.
The Sorites paradox is that if you take all of this as conditionals, if this is not a heap, and you add,
so if we start with, 1 grain of sand is clearly not a heap.
Yes.
10,000 grains of sand is a heap.
Is a heap. And then you have the general rule: if n is not a heap, and then n plus 1 is not a heap.
Right, because if 1 grain of sand is a heap, then 2 won't be a heap.
Yes,
and then
so
3 won't be a heap.
Yes, and then you have modus ponens applied. I don't know, 1,000 times, 1,000 applications of modus ponens gives you the paradox.
Right,
Okay.
because you're simultaneously saying that no 1 grain of sand is going to make a difference.
Yes.
But at some point it goes from not being a heap to being a heap.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So.
And Eubulides invented those paradoxes.
Yes.
And they're considered paradoxes of vagueness because they deal with these borderline cases where you're no longer sure if something is a heap or not a heap.
That is correct. You don't know how to classify it.
Okay.
Okay. So this is connected with vagueness, but actually vagueness need not involve by itself. Vagueness doesn't have to be associated with the Sorites paradox, because there are cases of vagueness in which there is not enough items to make a Sorites chain.
Okay.
Okay, for instance, if you say a large number of fingers has been infected, and I have 10 fingers on my hand, right? A large number of fingers has been infected. This is still vague, because you don't know what a large number of but it is a large number of fingers from 0 to 10, okay? And obviously 1 finger is not a large number, but 10 finger is a large number. But a finger can make a big difference, because it's simply too short to make a Sorites chain.
And what distinguishes vagueness in this case from just ambiguity?
Vagueness is this distinction from ambiguity is that you have a rule that if n is a large number, n plus 1 is also a large number. So there is a kind of a scale involved there. So whereas just ambiguity means simply very many meanings to the same word.
Right.
Like what is it? Bank. Bank can be a building in which there is a bank. Bank may be an institution of a bank, and bank may be a bank of a river. So if you open a dictionary, then almost all words in the dictionary will have words which are homonyms pronounced the same way, but they have different meanings.
So ambiguity plays on a multiplicity of meanings.
Yes.
Whereas vagueness is more concerned with some sort of phenomenon or phenomena that are scalar.
Yes.
So how tall you are,
right.
How big a heap is.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is sometimes, let's see, what is it's called tolerant predicates. Tolerant predicates is predicates which tolerate small increases.
And predicates being our properties for people who don't know.
Yes,
so,
predicate is just it's what in the language will correspond to. Predicate is like beautiful, great,
right.
tall,
and something like pitch
they will,
black.
they will, wait a minute, they will be correspond to adjectives.
Right, and something like pitch black is a predicate that has no tolerance at all, because pitch black, presumably, there's only one shade that's pitch black, whereas
this might as well be has some vagueness in it.
It might,
because pitch black itself, you may wonder, does this merit to be called pitch black or not? And then if it's a little bit more, then obviously if the smaller one merits and the bigger one merits, so there is no way in which in the natural language you can avoid it by adding some sort of adjective.
But we can, at least for purposes of argument, contrast that with something like tall, where there are clearly degrees. 6'1" is tall, 6'2" is tall. Yes. So there's tolerance in tallness, where there might be less tolerance in pitch blackness.
Yes,
and
that
for all
correct.
intents and purposes, now it's not a tolerant predicate.
Yes.
Do you happen to know how Eubulides treated these paradoxes, or did he simply just pose them and let other people deal with them?
He simply posed them.
Okay.
He was, so to speak, an adversary or an enemy of Aristotle. And they were also, I think, politically opposite, because he was a Democrat as far as I remember, and Aristotle, of course, was an aristocrat, and he was the teacher of Alexander, Athens were conquered by these northern tribes who came and invaded Macedonia. Okay, so Aristotle was politically also connected with what you would call a more rightist regime nowadays. Not a democracy, but a king or an emperor. Not an emperor that was later invented by the Romans, but a kingdom.
So the first responses to vagueness that I'm aware of are the Stoics, the early Stoics, like Chrysippus.
Yes, to tell you the truth, I don't remember exactly how they had. Okay,
I have an idea.
Okay,
and
I knew it. What exactly Chrysippus, how they responded to it, but right now I cannot recall exactly what the argument was.
Well, I think there are two interesting things about what Chrysippus did. Mm-hmm. So one, there was a normative element to the early Stoic treatment of vagueness. So they used the Sorites puzzles as a form of like training. So it was a question game. Yes. Somebody would ask, is 1 grain of sand a heap? Okay. Is 2 grains of sand a heap? Is 3 grains of sand a heap?
So you stop answering.
Right. And the trick was that you would just simply stop answering the question. Yes. And the reason that this was useful for them was they valued wisdom and not being quote-unquote precipitate in their judgments, because they didn't want to make mistakes. So they would use these sort of questioning games as tools.
They were skeptics, if you want, when it comes to knowledge, but they had an extreme moral code. Mm-hmm. So skepticism came with a strict moral code. And I think this is a natural combination.
But then the other thing was that they were realists about assertables or propositions. So they believed that...
But you shouldn't give your consent to something in which there's the slightest doubt. You shouldn't answer.
Right. But so the key was that while you might, and I'm going to be imprecise here, is that while they were committed to there being a bivalence of propositions, so every proposition is either true or false, everything assertable, they were not committed to the sort of impressions you might have of a Sorites chain, any particular conditional as corresponding to a fact in the world.
Right.
But I'd like to get to the more recent treatments of the Sorites paradoxes. And it starts, at least... I mean, Russell brings it into the 20th century.
That is correct.
But Frege had, to me, a very convincing, or at least intuitive, response to the bald man paradox.
Yes, but what do you remember what was Frege's response?
His response, I'm going to put it in the sort of vocabulary that we've been using so far today, even though he used terms like concept. But he would have denied that tolerant predicates are predicates at all. So he would have said that tallness, because it doesn't divide the world into those who are tall and those who are not tall, or baldness doesn't cleanly divide those who are bald and not bald in two groups, that it's just not a legitimate predicate at all. So you're making an assumption that
that is not exactly what
tell me what he exactly
was.
said.
This is, I think, as Russell represents him as having this position.
I'm just thinking of a letter he wrote to Marty where he says something to that effect.
Yes, Frege, yeah, that is correct. But first of all, you have to be aware of the fact that Frege was first and foremost committed to establishing the status of mathematics. So in mathematics, there are no vague predicates, and this is right.
Because something is or is not prime. It is or is not even.
Yeah, because the logic of mathematics doesn't
no tolerance.
allow. Yes, because otherwise you get a contradiction there by doing that. There is no tolerance. Now, Frege was aware of the fact that in natural language there is tolerance, but he treated it as a phenomena of ambiguity. So natural language is usually, this is of course means that it is also ambiguous. It cannot be. And in that case, he prescribed a somewhat arbitrary prescription to say, okay, you know what? In these cases, you extend the predicate in any arbitrary way, but you make it not tolerant, that's all. So you give a certain rule that here, I mean that this and not this, and this might be completely arbitrary as long as sentences get truth value true or false. So Frege's answer has been different when it comes to mathematics and when it comes to ordinary language. In ordinary language, he simply added this as a pragmatic rule to avoid the phenomena that the speaker asserts something and it is not clear whether it's true or false.
Okay.
So he said he proposed an completely arbitrary rule. Just, you make here you might say he suggested almost a legal practice of making a cutoff point in any way so as to avoid slippery slope phenomena.
It sort of reminds me of supervaluationism in that sense.
Yeah,
but I don't want to get into that.
No, the supervaluation is a different position,
right?
And I think it's I think it fine. Gave it up and so on. So I know that the philosophical literature is full of this, but it is not a good position.
So how then did he explicitly treat the bald man paradox?
The bald man paradox, you say, well, you decide in an arbitrary way of a cut-off point.
So and so hairs are distinguish somebody between baldness and...
That is correct.
Okay.
And you can see that the legislator sometimes does, in order to make the situation clear, not to have a slippery slope phenomena, introduces some arbitrary cutoff points, and that is it. It's, for instance, even nowadays, if you know that the Republican judges might overrule what is it?
Roe v. Wade.
Yes, Roe versus Wade. And then it is a question, when is a woman, when is the fetus considered viable? I mean, and then they would have to introduce an arbitrary point. I mean, the extreme point was whenever there is already a fertilization, then it is viable. This would be the extreme point. But you can put another point there. And different states will have different points.
Well, it's interesting how, I mean, a lot of people, and justifiably so, think of philosophy as being a sort of, to use a phrase Justin Clark Doane uses a lot, kind of pie in the sky.
Okay.
But in this case, we see how important vagueness is, particularly with regard to the law.
Yes.
I mean, the bald man paradox is, I mean, it's similar to, like you just pointed out, Roe v. Wade. You have to determine at some point when the fetus is viable.
Yes.
And it's not just as deciding when somebody isn't bald is vague. It's not obvious. It's going to be arbitrary at some point.
Yes, you
have to do the same thing.
You have to agree on an arbitrary cutoff point so that a judge would decide, because in that case there is no way of avoiding this, and so the idea of introducing an arbitrary cutoff point is the following. Okay. You hope that you won't arrive at that situation. So you make sure that the chance of getting you exactly into a situation in which one error would make a difference is very small. If it turns out that it is very important, then you make it sharper. Okay? I'll give you an example. Suppose a certain crime has occurred, and the crime has occurred on the border between two states. The question is, whose jurisdiction is valid here? Which state has a jurisdiction right, okay, to try this case? Mm-hmm. Okay, and when this is important, there are all kinds of procedure to make the border exactly as clear as possible. So sometimes you have a marking, a bridge, and you have some line in the bridge that this decides where it is. Okay, if it's not important, if there is no much chance of getting this, it doesn't matter. You can say, well, we leave the border not very well defined, because the chance of getting things exactly in the border region is very small. Is this clear? Mm-hmm. So this is a pragmatic rule, and when the decision is important, and when there is a chance that it will be just in the borderline case, you try to make the border as sharp as possible. So there is, for instance, a bridge. Then you mark on the bridge a certain line exactly there where the border passes. Now you can ask, what happens if somebody treads on the border line, and just like Jeremiah, Rabbi Jeremiah, and one there, and then, okay, fine, so we'll have to make the line thinner, or something like that. So the chance of being put in a problematic position in which you don't know goes to zero.
But so roughly, Frege's solution, or the way that he would look at the paradox as originally framed, is that the way that you're using the predicate bald is not precise enough. Yes. And in order to solve the paradox, you need to write this illegitimate use of the predicate bald.
That is correct.
Okay, and then I think that takes us to Russell, because Frege's Frege's approach already seems to be pretty linguistic.
Yeah,
Russell reduced vagueness to language, right?
Russell had an objections to Frege, that what Frege proposes is very arbitrary. To make it an arbitrary, and this misses the whole. And this misses the whole point of Frege. Frege said in mathematics there is no place for vagueness.
Right.
In natural language, just to make sure that people do not utter assertions which have no truth value, let's us for convenience put an arbitrary borderline, and so that to make sure that. And this is the example there is whether somebody is alive or is not alive. And Russell actually one argument of Russell against Frege that it is arbitrary is simply misses the whole point. Frege said, yes, it is arbitrary, but just we make it for convenience so that we will know that sentences have truth values in natural language. But then he had a better argument, and this is a stronger argument, that he gives the argument from, I think, Russell knew where to give good argument from, the Tempest, from the Shakespearean play Tempest. I mean, there is somebody who says, if my son is alive, then he is so and so and so. And this is in Shakespeare. And according to Frege, the truth value doesn't come as it should come.
From what I recall of Russell,
and this is a good argument against Frege, that it doesn't fit the natural language. Because if then is material conditional, and if my son is alive, then he is a king or something like that. He says, if my son is alive, then I am. So it is like material implication, but it gets the wrong truth value according to the Frege's construction, and it gets the right truth value according to Russell's construction.
From what I recall, though, the pith of Russell's view was, let's say, with the bald man paradox, is that the man's head just is what it is, and however many hairs there are, they are what they are. The problem is just that our language is too imprecise to account for the world. So there's no real problem with the bald man's head. It's just our language is not proper. So
yes, but then how do you make a language proper? I mean, that is the point. And there you get.
But did he attempt to give a solution to the paradox?
Yes, this is his theory of definite descriptions.
Okay.
This is the description, the unique so and so that has this property. Then it all depends on the scope condition.
So let's take an example. I think that he uses the example of Mont Blanc, maybe, where if you're standing on Mont Blanc. Mm-hmm. And you say, I am on Mont Blanc, it's true, and everybody will acknowledge that. Okay. But if you take one step down the mountain, people will still agree with it. And if you keep walking and you keep saying, I am on Mont Blanc, eventually you'll be in the sea and it'll be false. Yes. So where is the point at which you stop being on Mont Blanc? Yeah. And I think what he says, the problem is you just are where you are, but the issue is that
linguistic
is linguistic.
It's a linguistic issue, and that in that case you have no other recourse but to put an arbitrary.
Okay.
In order to make the language, in order to avoid this, you simply put an arbitrary.
So he says something similar to Frege then, in that the way to defease the paradox.
No, but he
diffuse it.
Yes, but his theory of definite descriptions depends on the scope. Not, you see. He gives a different analysis than Frege through his theory of definite descriptions.
So his theory of definite descriptions gives him a way of precisifying the language in a different way from Frege's.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. And it all becomes a scope phenomena. And the scope phenomena is the unique X such that, and so on. And then you have there exists. It is translated in a logical sentence, but if you have two sentences, it depends which scope is bigger than the other. And mathematics has maximal scope, so to speak.
Okay. So I know that there are plenty of other responses to the Sorites paradox. One, my favorite, just because of how simple it is simply saying that 4 grains of sand make a heap. And that's the end of the story,
because you have this.
If you have 3,
yes,
and then you put one on top, it's a heap.
but this is natural language doesn't behave in this way.
Okay.
That's obvious. This is a kind of a trick, is a kind of a conceptual analysis that it must be in 3 dimensions, and the minimal thing that can be in equilibrium and in 3 dimensions is you have 3 balls and a ball resting on top of them. That's that is.
But you don't find that convincing?
No, that is not at all convincing, because you can have other phenomena which are not exactly a heap, but baldness and so on, which isn't solved by this construction.
And presumably they're all.
And I think it's 4 grains of sand do not make a heap in natural language. Even if you look at under a microscope and see that 3 of them are.
If you ask 1,000 people if that's a heap, they'll probably say no.
Yes. Yes, they wouldn't look in a microscope and say, well, this is a heap, because there is 3 grains and the one rests on top of them.
There's another approach that we've talked about before, Diane Raffman's psychologistic approach. This is. Can you explain it?
Yes, she gives experimental results that show that the way, more or less, it is like this. Suppose you have a sequence of pictures showing to you, and you can now easily produce. You have such a efficient way of producing pictures by using various software. And then you can have a long sequence
where maybe it starts at red on one end.
No, it starts as a cat and ends as a dog.
Well, let's do the colors. Those are easier. So it starts at red on one end.
Yes.
Let's say there's 50 squares.
Yes.
And then it's orange on the other end.
Yes.
So just like with the heap, you go from not a heap to a heap. Here you go from red to orange. And they're each color square between the two is sort of a blending, and one goes from one to the other.
Yes, okay. So the empirical evidence is the following. Suppose you give me 2 colors, the extreme colors.
Red and orange.
Okay, red and orange. If you start from red and go to orange, then people maintain that it is red, differently than if you start from orange and go to red, because in the memory there is a strong memory that this is still red. Okay, so if you start with red, you will go a long way towards orange. You won't go all the way, but you will. The point in which people make an abrupt change, and this is actually, you do statistics with many people, the point depends on where you start, either from red to orange or from orange to red.
So perception plays a big role in it, our psychology.
No, the order in which these impressions come, because you want to preserve the previous impression.
Right, but that's a function of whatever's going on in our psychology.
Yes. But this is fine, but you cannot make. But here we don't want to. This is not a clinical, philosophical question. Here is not a clinical question that depends on the psychology of people, because people can be misled and so on. We want to give a normative account, not a psychologistic account.
But we still haven't explained how she treats the paradox. And what I think happens is. There's 2 experiments. Mm-hmm. In the first one, you show people red, then you ask them, is this red? And they say yes. Then you go to the next one, is this red?
Yes.
Is this red? Is this red?
Right.
And at some point, before you get to the perfectly orange square, they will say, this is no longer red, this is orange.
Okay.
But then they do another experiment where they show them pairwise, 2 at a time.
Okay.
And you ask, are these both red?
Okay.
So you show 2, the first 2 squares, are these both red? You say yes. Then you take the second square and you show it with the third square, and you ask, are these both red?
Right.
Then you take the third square and couple it with the fourth square. Are these both red?
Right.
And if you present them 2 at a time in this way, they get all the way to the end of the sequence, and they will still say that this is red.
Yeah, okay.
And so what she, as I recall, derives from this is that we have two, we might think of them as homunculi in our brain.
Yeah.
We have the categorizer and the discriminator.
Yeah, I remember now the
Right.
Okay, so what? But what kind of
And-
philosophical question is this?
But the bottom line is that she says that there's no real paradox here. It's just a product of the way that we view things.
Yes.
And we'll see a paradox in one place, depending on how the questions are framed or how we see the pictures, and then in another one we won't see them. It's all
But
just
this
a
is not
matter of psychology.
yes, but
And so what do you think about that?
this is not, I mean, this is not a completely unsatisfactory, because we want to have a normative account. Imagine, for instance,
What do you mean by normative in this case?
normative means, look, suppose I'll give you, suppose there are all kinds of tricks in which you mislead people to give wrong mathematical answers. It's well known that if you do it in a way, even there is a wrong answer that you can show that 0 equals 1 when and it can be in a complicated way. You show this and you ask, is this correct, is this correct, is this correct, is this correct? At the end you get the paradox 0 equals 1. Okay, so and you can express and this is explained on psychological answer. But I cannot say, well, it all depends on the way in which you present it, and sometimes 0 is equal to 1, and sometimes 0 is not equal to 1.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a normative answer. Okay, people make mistakes in mathematics, and you can induce these mistakes by presenting them with a lot of data. And you can see that at a certain point they will simply forget that this step is not legitimate. Now, if they forget that this state is not legitimate, you cannot say, well, whether 0 equals 1 or not depends on the way you present it to people.
Mm-hmm. Right. No,
Okay.
that makes sense to me.
Okay, and so this is a philosophy. The same is, just as a way you cannot do it with respect to mathematics, you cannot do it with respect to philosophy of language, because philosophy of language cannot be reduced. You might, of course, philosophy of language is a phenomena that people speak and people have intuitions and so on, but you simply cannot. You cannot solve it by giving a psychological account what brings people to do certain mistakes. That's all.
Okay.
So it's not, we want to have a language which is in principle free of contradiction, okay, and so that it does not depend the way you produce it or so on, that mistakes will be recognized as mistakes. Not, well, it depends. You cannot incorporate this is a fallacy to incorporate the psychology and to deduce everything which should be normative from the philosophical point of view to psychologism. This is a cheap psychologism. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
There is no mathematics. Mathematics is just what people tend to think psychologically. It's well known that people make a lot of mistakes when it comes to probabilities. And this is true, they make mistakes.
Speaking of...
But that doesn't mean that probability should be accommodating itself to what people think is probable or not.
Speaking of probability,
Mm-hmm.
I think we can move on now to another version or purported version of the Sorites paradox, which is the lottery paradox in degree theory.
Yes.
Can you tell me what the lottery paradox is?
Oh, the lottery paradox is that you say there is, so to speak, 1 in 10,000, 1 over 10,000 probability 1/10,000, I will give you probability as fractions of numbers, not as percentage, right? Or 99.9999%, or so there is a chance of 1/10,000 that you will win the lottery.
Okay, so there's a lottery with 10,000 tickets, and if you buy one, you have 1/10,000 chance of winning it.
Yes, and the winner wins an enormous amount, and so on.
$1 million, sure.
Okay, so suppose you want to make some practical decision. So you say, well, I cannot. The practical decision I cannot take care of the imagine a possibility. Suppose I have to plan a trip. Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
or say you have to sign a contract for $1 million house.
Yes.
If you only have a 1 in 10,000 chance of winning it, you're not going to sign this contract.
Right. You are not going to sign.
You're going to say, okay, there's virtually no chance that I'm going to win the lottery.
But then you continue this. You can if this I wouldn't sign. Suppose I repeat these things, and at a certain point I get.
And so you say, okay, so 1 ticket, I'm not going to win it. Add a ticket. 2 tickets, I'm still not going to win 2/10,000. And then
so
the rule
for every decision that you make, if you consider it in isolation, then you say, well, suddenly I can neglect the possibility of winning this versus not winning this when it comes to this.
Right, because 1 ticket, in the same way that 1 grain of sand doesn't make a difference in the heap, you also want to say that 1 ticket is so negligible that 1 ticket isn't going to make a difference in your chances of winning the lottery.
Okay. And so this is, again, so to speak, a paradox.
Because you
neglect the possibility of winning for every decision that you can make, for all the decisions that you can make. But
you also, most importantly, I think you end up neglecting the possibility that if you have all of the tickets, you will win the lottery.
That is what's called the lottery paradox.
Right.
So you neglect, and at the end, you come to, even if you have all the tickets, then also you neglect this possibility.
And I think whoever's listening can see the resemblance between the Sorites paradox and this paradox, because the assumption is, okay, if 0 grains of sand don't make a heap and 1 grain of sand doesn't make a difference, then 10,000 grains of sand won't make a heap. But that's obviously absurd, in the same way that having all 10,000 tickets and not winning the lottery is absurd.
Yes.
So
but this is different.
Right. But so first, before you explain the actual solution, because I like this solution, can you tell me what degree theory is and how they would try to account for this?
The degree theory is that you cannot speak about belief or not belief, but beliefs comes in degrees.
And not just belief, but truth.
If you want, truth comes in degrees.
So in the same way that, like we might say that, okay, 1 grain of sand is definitely not a heap, but 2 grains of sand might be
a little bit more
of a heap.
So the degree theory takes the notion of truth and makes of it a question of degrees.
So it's no longer bivalent. So every proposition is no longer just true or false. It's true or false to a certain degree.
Yes, that is correct.
Expressed as a decimal.
And this is a viable position.
Mm-hmm.
However, the lottery paradox, this is not a way to treat the lottery paradox.
But first, can you say how they would use it to treat the lottery paradox?
It is the same, that truth comes in degrees. So, so
we're just behaving irrationally. There's no paradox.
No, it's not irrationally. We behave rationally, but truth comes in degrees.
Okay.
Simply, truth comes in degrees. It is like the Sorites. It's like the Sorites. The Sorites degrees for the Sorites paradox looks a reasonable position.
Yes.
Okay? So it's a matter of degrees. Okay? This is not my solution, but I accept it as a very intuitive solution. The truth comes in degrees.
Mm-hmm.
However, this is true for the Sorites, but not true for the lottery paradox. Because if you want to treat the lottery paradox in this way, you miss something very important. And the important about the lottery paradox is that there is a place in which it jumps, really. Contrary to what you might thought, that it doesn't make there is
so
a
there
chance.
is a sharp cutoff point,
Yes.
whereas there isn't with the bald man or
Right,
the Sorites.
right.
So there is a point at which you should
You should
stop buying tickets.
Yes,
Okay.
that is the point.
Can you explain why that is?
It is simply that here you take, you have to use the notion of expected utilities.
Which is
Which is that you have a utility, which is also a function of, say, a real number of functions, of buying a lottery ticket or not buying a lottery ticket. So you have a utility function, and now how many lottery tickets it is worth for you to buy depends on this expected utility. And then there is a point in which, suppose, okay, so now, usually if you buy all the lottery tickets, you will get a price which is shorter than the price that you will pay for all the lottery tickets.
So if there were actually 10,000 tickets and they were $1 each, the prize might just be $7,000.
Okay.
And that's to discourage someone from just buying all the tickets.
No.
Well, that's not why. It's because
No.
they need to make money by holding the lottery.
The state lottery the state makes a lot of money by holding this lottery. So it's like in the casino, because
the house always wins.
The long run, the house always wins.
Mm-hmm.
This is probability rules and expected utilities and so on. But you might say, well, it's still worthwhile because the people enjoy it. They get, okay, so you give it, suppose they have some real satisfaction from buying and so on. Let this have a utility function for that. And then if you have a utility function, then it is, which takes care of your enjoyment or whatever is good, you consider good. So going, then you meet friends there and so on, this kind of thing. Give it a utility. And then, yes, it is buying one ticket, there is still, you should buy one ticket, you should buy two tickets. But at a certain point, the utility switches in an arbitrary way, the utility jumps. That the utility of buying n+1 ticket is smaller than the utility of buying n tickets. And then that is a place in which you should buy exactly n tickets and not n+1.
Right.
Because there is a switch of utilities which is a sharp.
So perhaps to summarize and simplify that, maybe there's a point at which the risk of winning is worth buying the tickets.
Yes.
But once you hit a certain number, you're expending so much money that the risk of losing outweighs.
That is correct.
So there is a sharp cutoff point between them.
Yes.
Where
So in the and this is the answer to the lottery paradox. The lottery paradox is really not a good paradox.
It's kind of it's not actually a paradox. It's something of economics or probability or whatever you want to call it. It's something that
people from the point of view of utility, there is also a whole literature which is devoted to explaining the economic rationality of people's decision. There is a whole work by Tversky and Kahneman, prospects and so on. What is the utility? Utility will depend on your total assets, and utility is depend on what you have. So somebody who is a millionaire and he wouldn't even bother buying one ticket or two tickets.
It's very individual.
It's very individual, but it depends on the total amount of money that you have. So it works either it is a certain curve like this or this, and there's a whole theory which takes care of this. And tries to make the odd behavior of people rational. But I think at the end you can show that people are very sensitive to the way the problem is being presented. You can present the problem in a slightly different way, and then all of a sudden you see that their judgments switch. So that the fact that people are irrational is a well-established psychological fact. And there's a well-known guaranteed irrational books written guaranteed irrational and so on. Is a famous writer, I forget names, is originally an Israeli theorist, probability, economic, and so on, and it shows how irrational people are by conducting a set of experiments. In one experiment, the people are asked to choose between two numbers, or to decide what to do, and this depends on a certain numerical value. Would they go with this or with this? And in another, the same group of people or an additional group of people is presented with the same questionnaire, but with an additional instruction. Please write your social security number on the top of the questionnaire. Just just your social security number. The mere fact that you write social security number at the top might change the decision of how to answer the questionnaire.
Do you know why that was?
I tell you why. The idea is the following. Suppose you are well-to-do, or doesn't matter, your economic status is one. You consider buying a ticket to the big, what is it, one of these huge baseball...
Super Bowl.
And then you consider, how much would you give to
How much would you pay for a Super Bowl ticket?
Yes. How much would you pay for a Super Bowl ticket? Or 2 Super Bowl tickets, or whatever. Okay, so people find it very difficult if their situation is kind of borderline situation. Is it worth it for me? Is it not worth it for me? They find it very difficult to make a precise evaluation of that. So if you write your social security number there, the social security number gives you, so to speak, a frame, a parameter in the frame. Now,
what do you mean? Like it gives you a monetary value, or
it gives you a value that you compare things by assuming this value.
But like you're subconsciously seeing your social security number, and you're saying, and it gives you
that this is, say, a medium number. This is a large number.
I see.
So if the social security number is higher, you would be willing to pay more money than not, because this is the frame.
That's very interesting.
This is the frame condition.
The way our minds work.
Yes, this is the frame, what is called the framing problem. You give them all kinds of information that really has no logical relation, but it gives you an impression of a number which is, yes, this is something I would be willing to.
Now,
this is a big number, or this is a reasonable number.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been a lot of experiments, a lot of them conducted. This is which made Kahneman and Tversky famous, and eventually gave Kahneman the Nobel Prize in Economics, where they conducted a lot of experiments in which they have shown that the way you present the same question to people in 2 different ways, and you get completely different answers.
Were they your students?
No, they were my same. We were on the same, what do you call it, cohort.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I thought Kahneman was a young guy. Not that you're not a young guy, but
No, he's older than me.
Kahneman?
Yes. Half a year or something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Kahneman is definitely older. Tversky is a little bit younger. So they are my cohorts.
I see.
And I knew them from Israel as cohorts.
Got it.
Okay, so so for instance, they even, you take doctors and which are professionals and so on, and you present the question that there is a certain medicine and you can give it, and etc., etc. And then you say, and by giving it, you will have 100 people
Die?
No, 100 people. You save 100 people.
Okay.
And then you give the same question, but you say, and then you risk that so and so many people will die. It is the same thing. Saving 100 is the same as losing 900, but in one case you use the phrase save,
I see.
and in other case you use the word lose.
Mm-hmm.
And logically the situation is such that saving 900 is the same as losing 100.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's the same. It's altogether there are thousands. Either some of them will be saved, some of them will be lost. But if you present the same alternative using the word save, then you would tend to give more of the medicine. Mm-hmm. And if you would lose the same thing of giving lose, you will judge not to give the medicine. This is given to professionals, to doctors, which are very high professionals, but all of them fall victim to this kind of illusion. It's like an optical illusion.
There was a story you told me, I don't recall if it was related to Zade's fuzzy logic or to degree theory, but it had to do with designing train stations, maybe in
Japan.
Did that have to do with vagueness at all?
In a roundabout.
Can you tell me that story? I thought it was really good.
Okay. So designing train means to control automatically, to have software which controls automatically the change in velocity as the train approaches.
Right. So
this should be a function of.
Wait. So they were designing a train station and they wanted to automate it.
Yes.
So they wanted some sort of software that could control the trains.
Yes.
Okay.
So the train approaches, and this will depend on all kinds of information that you have.
The automating software has to take into account the weather, all sorts of things.
All kinds of things. But then you put in the equations of physics and so on in order to find out how it should behave. And this became extremely difficult and impossible to do.
Because there are just so many variables, and it just would require a ton of computational power.
Yes.
But exactly. Human conductors are able to do it.
And what they end up is they took a human conductor and they monitored how he reacts, and they tried to imitate this conductor, and this succeeded.
Mm-hmm. And why did I think that this might have involved vagueness? Do you recall? Or maybe, and there's also something, I think that they did something...
Because the whole thing is, eventually, from a point of view of human, it is vague. The conductor wouldn't be able to give you the sharp cut. This is the way I do it.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so there will be no sharp answer. You will just and the conductor there might be a small number of cases in which the conductor would be at a loss. But it is still worthwhile to imitate the conductor rather than to imitate the differential equations, to bring all the differential equations and to take care of that.
And wasn't it also the case that they had to implement some degree of chance there because the human is kind of random and unpredictable?
They did.
Yeah.
But the chance but the first attempt to work out the partial differential equations which control the whole thing was much beyond they could do with the computer that they had. It is nowadays neural networks and the whole thing of artificial intelligence and so on. It all goes by making the computer learn and making the computer simulate human behavior. And eventually they don't even know how these experimental results will affect. So they end up by having a prescription which all they can say is, yes, the computer decided this, and the computer has a very good record of making good decisions.
So before we finish today, I'd like to hear a bit about how you ended up solving vagueness, or solving vagueness. Well, I think you developed a new logic called contextual logic.
No, well, I mean, the fact, yes, I had the notion of context is well known, and this is the fact that everything is, a lot of things are contextual and so on.
But so the
point is that the way I did it, I thought that vagueness is...
I think you think of vagueness as, to use the parlance of the day, a feature, not a bug. So vagueness isn't something that we're trying to get rid of.
Yes.
The way that...
I think, okay, so vagueness is mostly a linguistic phenomena. And vagueness is very important, and it is very useful. Okay, so it is not that following perhaps a certain line of thought we should be as precise as possible. We have to be vague because this is more practical. Okay, and for instance, if you say, "I'll meet you around I'll meet you." midday, I'll meet you around 1 o'clock. Obviously, if I come later, 2 minutes after 1, I'm still fulfilling the promise.
Mm-hmm.
If I come half an hour after 1, that's not so good. Okay, you told me 1, you didn't tell me 1:30. But we wouldn't quibble if I do it at 1 in 5, 5 after 1, or 7 after 1, and so on.
So it enables you to be flexible.
Yes.
And something this reminds me of is, going back to Social Security numbers, there's a reason that we sort of sacrifice clarity
yes.
in order to facilitate our everyday interaction. So while we could have a perfect naming system in which everybody is named by their Social Security number, we have 10,000 Johns in this country, but
10,000, several.
Maybe a couple million.
Take family names even.
But the point is just that we take advantage of the context. I might only know 1, 2, or 3 Johns,
yes.
And even though that's ambiguous, it's not vague because there's no scalar component.
Right.
Like we mentioned, it enables us to be flexible and get along with one another.
Right. So this is...
So that's the rough overview of the attitude you took towards vagueness, is that we don't want to get rid of it. We just sort of want to understand it better.
Right. But the point is really that vagueness, we presuppose it's a kind of a local phenomena, because it depends on eventually there might be sharp cutoff points, but these are very rare. The point we risk the fact that there will be a sharp cutoff point, but it is worthwhile because of chance of doing exactly which will bring us to is very small. So, and it is a linguistic phenomena. Vagueness would be a linguistic phenomena. and it is a local phenomenon.
Hanka, could we possibly have 5 more minutes?
Oh, am I disturbing you with my presence?
It's just coming up on the microphones.
Oh,
So just
sorry.
5 more minutes.
Half an hour, no rush. Whatever you need.
Okay.
Start it.
Okay.
Start singing.
I think it should just be 5 or so more minutes. But thank you.
You're very welcome.
Okay.
Okay, so my example was take the property of being rich.
Hmm.
Okay,
That smells good, though. It smells onions or something.
yeah. So take the property of being rich, and this is vague. Okay, and there is no sharp cutoff point.
I was vague with 5 minutes. It might be 7.
Yes. So usually by definition this is tolerant.
Richness is tolerant.
Yeah.
It's a tolerant predicate.
Yes, by definition it's a linguistic rule. It's not something to do with logic or ontology or things. It's a linguistic rule. For instance, you want to is Rachel? Is our friend Rachel rich, or is she poor? Okay. And you suppose you know all her assets and whatever she has in the bank and so on. So you made all this is known. Is she rich? And you say no, she's not rich. Okay, or you might even say she's poor. Okay, I say wait a minute. Now she picked up a penny from the pavement. She picked out a penny. Now she is rich. This is, by a linguistic rule, impossible.
Mm-hmm.
This scenario contradicts the rule of language. This is the source of the Soriteness in the case of rich and poor.
Okay.
You add a penny, you add a penny, you add a penny, you add a penny. And these are predicates which are supposed to work in the overwhelming number of cases that we encounter. Of course, if you repeat this rule a lot of time, there will be a place in which you will be forced to say rich, but this is the risk that you run. So these are all they are supposed to be employed locally.
And by locally, you mean?
In a context.
In a specific context, under a certain number of applications.
Right. The context should not include a cutoff point.
Right.
Yes. The context is that it is in a certain context which doesn't repeat itself 10,000 times to have this modus ponens rule and move you to another context. Of course, in very rare cases, you will be forced to do so, but the judgment is that there is a very small chance that you will encounter in practical life these cases. It is just like deciding where the jurisdiction of a certain state stops. So for instance, in the border between South Korea and North Korea, they included a whole mechanism to decide what is a border. So there is a certain neutral zone, and then there is a certain procedure and a kind of procedural decision where the border between because there it is very important not to get the things wrong, because both states don't want to get involved in a war that none of them wishes for.
And so what you're doing is not necessarily trying to solve vagueness, but to give us a certain degree of insight into what is happening.
Yes.
And to...
I think this is a solution of vagueness. Vagueness is the willingness to take a chance that something will switch very extremely where the chance is very small.
Okay.
To take the risk that there will be you will have to do something like that by repeating a lot of things. You will come to a situation in which you will make an abrupt chance, but provided that the chance is very small. So vagueness, all the vague predicates are supposed to be used within a context in which vagueness is tolerated.
I see. So are there any last things that you want to say about vagueness? I think that we've touched on some of the key points.
Yes, I think this is what vagueness. I mean, you have to. There are some mathematical theorems that have to be proven there about the logic of vagueness,
Right.
and about things.
Your paper is very formal and technical. There's a lot of symbols that.
Yeah, the paper is technical, but then I declare, yes, you can prove this, you can prove this, and you can prove this, and I proved. I hope I can still reconstruct. This was more of a philosophical paper. I noticed that in philosophical papers, if you say you can prove this, you don't have to bring the proof. No, the point is to look. I mean, people made a career on works which were mathematically faulty.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess one last thing. You had a nice example in your paper on vagueness about from the law that I think a student pointed you to with regard to motorized vehicles and skateboards.
Yes.
Just as another application of how this is relevant to the actual world.
Oh, the actual world, not having slippery slope situations in which you get from one to extreme the other. This is when you come to law, then the law makes an arbitrary decision, which will be the cutoff points. So
we talked about the Roe v. Wade example, but maybe you could just give one more example about how, in particular, your
this
solution
is a
might be
motorized. Okay, so at a certain playground where children play, and so there is a rule that you cannot have a vehicle, a motorized vehicle, but you can use skateboards. And now the question is, suppose you have a skateboard, I think, which is motorized. Does it fall in this or does it fall in that? And in evolution theory, there is animals you don't know. Is it a mammal?
Like a platypus?
Yes, a platypus, a famous example. This is it lays eggs, and the eggs from the eggs the eggs hatches, and there is small platypus, and the small platypus suckle milk from the mother. Mm-hmm. You see, the mother feeds them with milk. Is it a mammal, or is it
reptile?
A reptile or something like that.
Yeah.
So in biology, you have all the time things like that, and also
how do you explain those things?
All nature.
you would just say that it's a linguistic issue, right?
No, that case, no, it's not a linguistic issue, because it's an issue that the philosophy of science has to solve at this case. What is more important from the point of view of the theory? This is what's called natural predicates. Quine has a very nice paper about natural predicates. And natural predicates, it depends from the point of view of the whole theory. Does the theory look more appealing and more well built if you classify it as a reptile or as a mammal? You see, so it is. It might be deep, for instance.
So it's not purely linguistic in that it clearly has relevance to our science.
Right. It's also normative. It's normative because but the considerations involve the whole theory. Does this make the theory more smooth? Does it make the theory more transparent? Does it give us indications what to research, what experiment to do, and so on and so forth? This is what's called natural predicates. And Quine has a nice paper about that. That is the considerations of the whole theory. These are normative considerations also in jurisprudence. When you have legal theory, this is also, it depends on how your whole theory looks if you make this decision or this decision.
Okay. Well, I think that about covers it for today. Thanks again for doing this with me.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll get to do another one or two before I leave.
Okay, hopefully.
Okay.